We remember the big names, the presidents and prime ministers who gave the speeches, the five-star generals who moved armies on giant maps. Their faces are in the history books. Their statues stand in city squares. But a war isn't won by a handful of men. It's a vast, complex machine. Victory depends on thousands of interlocking parts, many of them invisible. It depends on people who never gave a famous speech or accepted a formal surrender. What if the key to landing on the beaches of Normandy wasn't a general, but a boat builder from New Orleans? What if the most effective spy against the German regime was a Spanish chicken farmer who couldn't stand the sight of blood? What if a forgotten British general in the jungles of Burma did more to change modern warfare than his famous counterparts in Europe? The Second World War was won in code-breaking huts, in university laboratories, on factory floors, and in secret meetings in occupied cities. It was won by people whose names are mostly footnotes, if they appear at all. These are the stories of the organizers, the inventors, the spies, and the quiet commanders who were absolutely crucial to the outcome. Their work saved millions of lives, yet most of us would not recognize their names. Why have their stories been left in the shadows? Number 17, could an actress's hobby change naval warfare? Hedy Lamarr was known for her face. She was a famous film star in the 1930s and 40s, one of the most celebrated beauties of her time. But behind the Hollywood glamour was a sharp, inquisitive mind. She was an inventor. It wasn't just a hobby. She had a real talent for it. Her first husband had been an Austrian arms dealer, and she had been forced to sit through countless dinner parties with engineers and military officials. She didn't just sit there. She listened. She absorbed technical details about weapons systems. When she came to America and the world edged closer to conflict, she wanted to do more than just sell war bonds. She knew that radio-controlled torpedoes were a promising new weapon, but they had a major flaw. The radio guidance signal could be easily jammed by the enemy. If you could block the frequency, the torpedo would go off course. It was a simple, effective countermeasure. Lamarr thought about this problem constantly. She wanted to find a way to make the signal unjammable. The breakthrough idea came from a surprising place. She was talking with her friend, the avant-garde composer George Antheil. Antheil was known for his wild experimental music. One of his pieces, Ballet Mécanique, required 16 synchronized player pianos. To get them to work together, he had used rolls of perforated paper similar to old-fashioned music boxes. The pianos would jump from one note to another in a prearranged synchronized pattern. That was it. That was the spark. Lamarr realized you could do the same thing with the radio frequency. What if the transmitter and the receiver in the torpedo could both jump from frequency to frequency at the same time? It would be like a player piano, but with radio waves. An enemy trying to jam the signal would only hear a fraction of a second of noise on one frequency before the signal hopped to another. To block it, they would need to know the exact hopping sequence, which would be practically impossible. They called it frequency hopping. In 1942, Lamarr and Antheil were granted U.S. patent 2,292,387 for their secret communication system. They gave it to the U.S. Navy for free. They wanted to help the war effort, but the Navy wasn't interested. The technology based on player piano mechanics seemed too clunky and weird. They filed the patent away and told the movie star to stick to selling war bonds. The idea was shelved. It was too far ahead of its time. The patent expired, but the concept didn't die. In the 1950s, engineers at Sylvania rediscovered the idea. With the advent of transistors and modern electronics, they could finally build what Lamarr and Antheil had imagined. The Navy started using frequency hopping technology in the 1960s during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It became a cornerstone of secure military communications. But the technology didn't stop there. Today, frequency hopping is the basis for most modern wireless communication. It's in your Wi-Fi, it's in your Bluetooth headphones, it's in your GPS. Every time you connect a device wirelessly, you are using the direct descendant of an idea dreamed up by a Hollywood actress and an experimental composer. They received no money and, for decades, no credit. Hedy Lamarr was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in 2014, 14 years after her death. What other brilliant war-winning ideas were dismissed by military bureaucracy simply because they came from an unconventional source? How many patented inventions from that era are sitting in archives, their potential still unrecognized. If the Navy had implemented frequency hopping in 1943, could it have dramatically changed the course of the war at sea? Number 16, what if the man who unified a country's resistance was a ghost? In 1943, the French resistance was a mess. It was a fractured collection of small, competing groups. There were communists, socialists, conservatives, and people with no political affiliation at all. They shared a common enemy, but they didn't trust each other. They argued over strategy, resources, and leadership. This division made them weak and easy for the occupying forces to infiltrate and destroy. The movement needed a leader. Not a general, but a unifier. That unifier was Jean Moulin. Before the war, he was a civil servant, a prefect who administered regions of France. He was a bureaucrat known for his organizational skills and his quiet determination. When his country was defeated in 1940, he refused to cooperate with the new regime. He was removed from his post. He then made his way to London to meet with Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French forces. De Gaulle gave Moulin an impossible mission: go back to France, parachute into the occupied territory, find the leaders of the 8 major resistance groups, and persuade them all to unite under a single command loyal to de Gaulle. He was essentially a ghost, operating with a false name, with no official power, trying to herd cats in the most dangerous place on earth. As Moulin was a master of clandestine operations, he was meticulous, patient, and incredibly brave. For over a year, he traveled secretly across France, meeting with grizzled guerrilla fighters, communist organizers, and conservative ex-soldiers. He met them in the back rooms of cafes, in drafty barns, and on quiet city park benches. He didn't command them, and he listened, he reasoned, he convinced them that their small rivalries were meaningless compared to the larger goal. He was the vital link carrying messages and money from London, but more importantly, he carried the idea of a single, unified France. His greatest achievement came on May 27, 1943. In a small apartment in Paris, under the constant threat of discovery, he brought together the leaders of the 8 major resistance groups. They represented the entire political spectrum. In that room, they formally created the National Council of the Resistance, Conseil National de la Resistance. It was a historic moment. For the first time, the fragmented internal resistance had a single coordinated body. They all recognized de Gaulle as their leader. This act gave the French resistance immense political legitimacy. It proved to the Allies that France was not a defeated nation, but a country with a government in exile and a functioning unified army in the shadows. This was crucial for ensuring France had a seat at the table after the war. Just a few weeks later, Moulin was betrayed. He was captured in Caluire, a suburb of Lyon. He was interrogated for days. He never spoke. He never gave up the names of his comrades or the secrets of the council he had built. He protected his creation to the very end. He died on a train while being transported to a camp in Germany. He had succeeded in his mission, but he paid the ultimate price. His work transformed the resistance from a collection of scattered rebels into a coherent Fourth Army that provided vital intelligence and sabotage for the Allied invasion. As historian Robert O. Paxton noted in his book Vichy France Old Guard and New Order, 1940 to 1944, the unification Moulin achieved was more political than military, but it was the political victory that secured France's future. We know Jean Moulin was betrayed, but the identity of the informant is still one of the most debated mysteries in French history. Was it a rival within the resistance or someone who broke under pressure? How did one man, a civil servant with no military background, manage to earn the trust of so many disparate and suspicious guerrilla leaders? What other diplomatic missions like Moulin's were happening in other occupied countries, quietly shaping the post-war world before the fighting had even stopped? Number 15, did a Soviet designer's obsession with simplicity win the air war on the Eastern Front? The war on the Eastern Front was a brutal contest of numbers and endurance. The scale was almost unimaginable. Both sides needed weapons that were effective, but more importantly, they needed weapons that could be produced in massive quantities by a semi-skilled workforce and maintained in the harshest conditions imaginable. This was especially true for fighter aircraft. A sophisticated, high-performance plane was useless if you could only build a few, or if it broke down in the middle of a Russian winter. Artem Mikoyan was not a flashy genius. He was a pragmatic Soviet aircraft designer. Along with his partner Mikhail Gurevich, he founded the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau, known as MiG. Their philosophy was simple build aircraft that were tough, easy to fly, easy to build, and easy to fix. Performance was important, but reliability and producibility were everything. The first major success, the MiG-3, was designed as a high-altitude interceptor. It performed well at heights above 16,000 feet. The problem was, most of the air combat on the Eastern Front happened at low to medium altitudes, where the MiG-3 was sluggish and outclassed by its German counterparts. Early in the war, Soviet pilots suffered terrible losses. The design wasn't right for the job. This is where Mikoyan's leadership came in. Instead of trying to perfect a flawed concept, he and his bureau learned from their mistakes. They listened to pilots. They studied wrecked enemy aircraft. They focused on what was actually needed on the front lines, a fighter that could dominate at lower altitudes, a plane that was fast, agile, and heavily armed. And it had to be made mostly of wood. Metal, especially aluminum, was in critically short supply. The result of this pragmatic approach was a series of aircraft that changed the balance of power in the air. While later designs like the Yak-3 and La-5 often get more credit, the iterative improvements pioneered by the MiG Bureau set a new standard for Soviet aviation. They focused on what worked. They used wooden wings and steel tube fuselages, materials that were readily available. They put powerful cannons on their planes. They made the controls simple. A farmer who had only a few dozen hours of flight training could be reasonably effective in one. A mechanic could patch a bullet hole in a wooden wing with glue and fabric in a field workshop. This philosophy of mass production and battlefield simplicity was a strategic weapon. While the German aviation industry was building complex, technically advanced aircraft that required specialized factories and expert mechanics, the Soviets were churning out tens of thousands of good enough fighters. The sheer number of planes was overwhelming. By 1944, the Soviet Union was producing aircraft at a rate the Axis powers simply could not match. According to research from historians like von Hardesty, author of Red Phoenix, The Rise of Soviet Air Power, 1941 to 1945, this industrial might was a decisive factor. Artem Mikoyan wasn't just designing planes, he was designing a system of aerial warfare that could win through attrition and industrial scale. His true genius was in understanding the brutal logic of the Eastern Front. How many design documents from the MiG Bureau were lost or remain classified in Russian archives, showing radical ideas that were never built? Did Soviet designers secretly incorporate features from captured Allied aircraft, like the P-39 Airacobra, into their own designs more than is publicly admitted? What if the Soviet Union had focused its resources on a smaller number of highly advanced superplanes? Instead of mass-producing simpler models, would it have lost the air war? Number 14. How do you supply an invasion without a port? The D-Day landings on June 6, 1944 were the largest amphibious invasion in history, but the success of the invasion didn't just depend on getting soldiers onto the beaches. It depended on what happened next. An army of hundreds of thousands of men needs a constant supply of food, fuel, ammunition, and equipment. A modern army needs about 800 tons of supplies per day for every 25,000 men. The Allies needed to land thousands of tons of cargo every single day. The problem was the major ports in the region, like Cherbourg, were heavily fortified. Capturing one could take weeks, and it would likely be destroyed in the process. You couldn't sustain an invasion without a port. So the Allies decided to bring their own. It was one of the most audacious engineering projects of the war. The idea was to build two massive artificial harbors, codenamed Mulberry, and tow them across the English Channel. Each harbor would be the size of the port of Dover. It was a crazy, unprecedented idea, and the man who helped make it possible was Ove Arup. Arup was a Danish-English engineer. He wasn't a military man. He was a philosopher of engineering, known for his innovative work with reinforced concrete. He believed that design should be holistic, blending architecture and engineering seamlessly. When the Mulberry Harbor project began, Arup and his firm were brought in to help solve the immense technical challenges. The project was a puzzle of massive proportions. The harbors needed outer breakwaters to calm the rough seas of the channel. These were made from huge, hollow, concrete caissons, codenamed Phoenixes. Some were as big as a 6-story apartment building. They had to be built in England, floated across the channel, and then sunk in precise locations to form a wall. There also needed to be floating piers, codenamed whales, that could rise and fall with the tide, connected to pierheads called spuds. Arup's contribution was crucial to the design and construction of the Phoenix caissons. He and his team applied their deep knowledge of reinforced concrete to make these structures strong enough to withstand the sea, yet light enough to be towed. They calculated the stresses, refined the designs, and helped supervise the construction. It was a race against time. Thousands of workers across Britain built the components in secret. An essay in the Arup Journal from 1968 details his firm's specific contributions to the hydrodynamic and structural designs. In the days after the invasion, the components were towed across the channel. The plan worked. Two harbors, Mulberry A at Omaha Beach for the Americans and Mulberry B at Arromanches for the British and Canadians, were assembled. They were an engineering marvel. But on June 19th, a massive storm, the worst in 40 years, hit the channel. Mulberry A was completely destroyed, but Mulberry B at Arromanches held. It was damaged but repairable. For the next 10 months, Port Winston, as it was called, became the single most important port in Europe. Over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies came ashore through this artificial harbor. It was the logistical lifeline that allowed the Allied armies to break out of Normandy and advance across France. Dwight D. Eisenhower himself said it was one of the key reasons for their success. Ove Arup's quiet, technical genius helped pour the concrete foundations of victory. What if the Great Storm had destroyed both Mulberry harbors? Could the Normandy invasion have failed, bogged down on the beaches for lack of supplies? Are there records of Arup's initial, even wilder, designs for the artificial harbors that were rejected as being too impossible to build? How much of the Mulberry technology was based on secret pre-war studies of marine engineering that have never been declassified? Number 13. Could the war have been won by the first programmers? When we think of war technology, we think of planes, tanks, and ships. We don't usually think of computers. But the Second World War was also a war of numbers. Calculating ballistic firing tables for new artillery, modeling atomic chain reactions, breaking complex codes, all of these required immense, tedious calculations. In the early 1940s, a computer was not a machine. It was a job title, usually held by a woman who would solve mathematical equations all day long with a pencil and a desktop calculator. It was slow, and it was prone to error. Grace Hopper was a math professor at Vassar College. She had a PhD from Yale. When the war started, she wanted to serve. In 1943, she joined the U.S. Navy Reserve. Because of her background in mathematics, she was assigned to a top-secret project at Harvard University. It was called the Bureau of Ordnance Computation Project. Her new boss was Commander Howard Aiken, and her new assignment was a machine called the Mark I. The Harvard Mark, I was a monster. It was a 50-foot long, 8-foot high electromechanical beast made of switches, relays, rotating shafts, and clutches. So it weighed 5 tons. It was essentially the world's first large-scale automatic digital computer, and nobody really knew how to use it. When Hopper arrived, Aiken handed her a code book and told her to figure out how to program the machine. There was no programming language. There was no manual. Hopper had to learn the machine's architecture from the blueprints. She and her team essentially had to invent the discipline of modern computer programming from scratch. They fed instructions to the machine on a long strip of paper tape. A hole in the tape meant one thing. No hole meant another. It was painstaking work. One tiny error in the tape and the whole calculation would be wrong. Hopper and her team ran the Mark I 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the rest of the war. They calculated artillery firing tables, which were vital for accuracy on the battlefield, but their most secret and important work was for the Manhattan Project. John von Neumann, a key scientist on the project, would bring his complex equations to them. Hopper's team programmed the Mark I to run the calculations for the implosion lens of the first atomic device. These were calculations that would have taken months for a team of human computers. The Mark I did them in days. As documented in Kurt Byer's book, Grace Hopper and the Invention of the Information Age, her work was instrumental in proving the theoretical physics behind the project. Grace Hopper didn't just operate the machine. She understood it. She developed new programming techniques. She famously coined the term bug, when a moth got stuck in one of the machine's relays, causing an error. She literally debugged the computer. Her work at Harvard laid the foundation for the entire field of software development. She went on to have a legendary career, creating the first compiler and co-developing the COBOL programming language. But her first and perhaps most crucial contribution was as a wartime pioneer, one of the world's first true programmers, turning a clanky metal monster into a tool that could solve the war's most complex mathematical problems. How many critical wartime projects were delayed or failed because the necessary calculations were simply too complex for human computers to solve in time? What secret calculations beyond the Manhattan Project did Hopper's team run on the Mark I that are still classified? If a programming error had been made in the implosion calculations, could it have set the atomic project back by months or even years? Number 12, how does an army of former prisoners change the fate of a battle? In 1941, following the German invasion of the Soviet Union, a strange and desperate agreement was made. The Sikorsky-Maysky Agreement allowed for the formation of a Polish army on Soviet soil. The soldiers for this new army were to be drawn from the hundreds of thousands of Polish citizens who had been deported to Soviet labor camps and prisons after the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939. They were starved, sick, and scattered across the vast expanse of the Gulag. The man tasked with finding them and turning them into an army was General Ladislaw Anders. And Anders was a prisoner himself. He had been captured by Soviet forces and held in the infamous Lubyanka prison in Moscow. He was released to lead this new force. What he found was a humanitarian disaster. Men, women, and children emerged from the camps, little more than skeletons. They had no equipment, no food, no medicine. Anders' first job was not as a general, but as a rescuer. He set up recruitment centers and desperately tried to care for the flood of emaciated people who flocked to them. The political situation was fraught with tension. The Soviets were reluctant allies, providing minimal support and viewing the independent Polish force with suspicion. It became clear to Anders that his army could not survive, let alone fight, inside the Soviet Union. Through intense diplomatic negotiations, he secured an agreement to evacuate his people, both soldiers and civilians, out of the Soviet Union and into British-controlled Persia, modern-day Iran. It was a massive exodus, a modern-day Moses leading his people out of bondage. Over 115,000 Polish citizens were evacuated in 1942. In the Middle East, this collection of survivors was transformed into a professional fighting force, the Polish II Corps. They were equipped by the British and trained for modern warfare. They were fiercely motivated. They were fighting not just for Allied victory, but for a free Poland. They were known as Anders' Army. Their most famous moment came in Italy in 1944. The Allied advance had stalled at the formidable Gustav Line, a series of German fortifications built across the narrowest part of the Italian peninsula. The key to the line was Monte Cassino, a rugged mountain topped by a historic monastery. For months, Allied forces from America, Britain, India, and New Zealand had tried to take the mountain, suffering horrific casualties in a series of failed assaults. The battle had become a bloody stalemate. The Allied command decided to give the Polish II Corps the task of taking the fortress. It was seen as an almost impossible job. On May 11th, the Poles launched their attack. For 7 days, they fought a brutal, close-quarters battle, clawing their way up the mountain slopes against entrenched, determined defenders. The fighting was savage. But on May 18th, the 12th Podolian Uhlans Regiment finally raised the Polish flag over the ruins of the monastery. They had done it. They had broken the Gustav Line. The road to Rome was open. The victory at Monte Cassino, detailed in books like Matthew Parker's Monte Cassino, the story of the hardest-fought battle of World War II, was a huge morale boost for the Allies and a testament to the incredible journey of Anders' army. They had gone from the depths of the Gulag to one of the most significant victories of the Italian campaign. Ladislaw Anders was the leader who made it all possible. How many Polish soldiers and civilians died in the Soviet Union before they could reach Anders' recruitment centers, a number that has never been accurately determined. Were there secret agreements between Anders and the British to use his army for political leverage against the Soviets in post-war negotiations? What became of the detailed personal accounts and diaries written by the soldiers of the Polish II Corps, many of which may still be held in private family collections? And number 11 was the atomic age born, because one scientist took a walk in the snow. The story of the atomic bomb is often centered on the massive industrial and scientific effort of the Manhattan Project in the United States. But the key scientific discovery, the one that made it all theoretically possible, happened years earlier in Europe, and the scientist at the center of it was largely written out of the story. Her name was Lise Meitner. Meitner was a brilliant Austrian physicist of Jewish heritage working in Berlin in the 1930s. She was a pioneer in the field of radioactivity and the head of the physics department at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry. Her closest colleague was a German chemist named Otto Hahn. For years, they worked together, bombarding uranium with neutrons, trying to create heavier elements. It was cutting-edge, Nobel Prize-worthy research, but in 1938, the political situation in Germany became impossible. After the annexation of Austria, her Austrian citizenship no longer protected her. She was forced to flee, escaping to Sweden with just a few small suitcases. She lost her position, her laboratory, her research, and her home, but she did not lose her connection to the work. She continued to correspond with Hahn, who kept doing the experiments they had designed together. In December 1938, Hahn wrote to Meitner with a baffling result. When he bombarded uranium with neutrons, he found traces of barium, an element that was much lighter than uranium. It made no sense. It was like smashing a rock and finding sand. He was a chemist. He knew his results were correct, but he couldn't explain the physics. Meitner received the letter while staying at a small hotel in rural Sweden during the Christmas holiday. Her nephew, the physicist Otto Frisch, was visiting her. They went for a walk in the snowy woods to discuss Hahn's strange findings. As they walked, Meitner started doing calculations in her head and on scraps of paper. She remembered Albert Einstein's famous equation, EMC2. She realized that the uranium nucleus wasn't chipping, it was splitting in two, and in that split, a tiny amount of mass was being converted into a huge amount of energy. She and Frisch calculated that the energy released from a single splitting atom was enormous. They had discovered nuclear fission, where Frisch went back to his lab in Copenhagen and experimentally confirmed their theory. They published their findings in the journal Nature in February 1939. It was a world-changing paper, but the credit was already being misplaced. In 1944, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the discovery of nuclear fission was awarded to Otto Hahn alone. Meitner was not included. Hahn, in his Nobel lecture, barely mentioned her contributions. The historical record was skewed. As described in Patricia Reif's biography, Lise Meitner and the Dawn of the Nuclear Age, Meitner was a victim of both political persecution and scientific sexism. Despite her exclusion, it was her insight during that walk in the snow that provided the fundamental understanding of fission, the process that would define the rest of the war and the century that followed. Did Otto Hahn deliberately downplay Meitner's role after the war to enhance his own reputation in a defeated Germany? What other groundbreaking scientific insights did Meitner have that were lost or ignored because of her forced exile? If Meitner had not been forced to flee Berlin, would she and Hahn have discovered fission earlier? And how might that have changed the timeline of the atomic project? Number 10, could a retired pilot in China change the course of the war in the Pacific? In 1941, America was not yet at war, but the government was looking for ways to help China, which had been fighting a brutal invasion by Japan since 1937. The Chinese Air Force had been all but wiped out. The Japanese controlled the skies. The supply line keeping China in the war, the Burma Road, was under constant air attack. And China's leader, Chiang Kai-shek, pleaded for American help. The U.S. government couldn't officially send its military. So they came up with a creative solution. They would allow a private military contractor to help the Chinese. This contractor was a retired U.S. Army Air Corps captain named Claire Lee Chennault. Chennault was a maverick. And he was a brilliant tactician and a fierce advocate for fighter planes, but his abrasive personality and radical ideas had clashed with the military brass, forcing him into early retirement. He had been working as an advisor to the Chinese Air Force since 1937. With secret presidential approval, Chennault was authorized to recruit pilots and ground crew from the U.S. military. They would re-sign their commissions and sign contracts with a shell company to fly for China. They were mercenaries, paid a good salary, plus a bonus for every Japanese plane they shot down. This group became the first American volunteer group, better known as the Flying Tigers. Chennault was a brilliant teacher. He knew his pilots, flying their Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, could not dogfight the more nimble Japanese fighters. The P-40 was faster in a dive and had better armor, but it couldn't turn as well. So Chennault developed a completely new set of tactics. He taught his pilots to never get into a turning fight. Instead, they should use their superior speed to make a single diving pass at the enemy, fire their guns, and then dive away to escape. It was hit-and-run tactics for the air. He also established a sophisticated early warning network, using Chinese observers with radios scattered across the countryside to report incoming enemy planes. The Flying Tigers went into combat in December 1941, just after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Their impact was immediate and devastating. In just over 6 months of combat, they were credited with destroying almost 300 Japanese aircraft, while losing only a handful of their own. The numbers documented in books like Daniel Ford's Flying Tigers, Claire Chennault, and his American Volunteers 1941 to 1942 are astonishing. They achieved a kill ratio that has rarely been matched. Their strategic importance was even greater than their impressive statistics. They protected the vital supply lines into China. They gave the Chinese people a desperately needed symbol of hope. And they shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility in the air. Chennault's tactical innovations, born from a deep understanding of his own aircraft's strengths and his enemy's weaknesses, became standard practice for American pilots throughout the Pacific War. He proved that superior tactics could defeat a numerically and sometimes technologically superior foe. How many of the Flying Tigers' claimed victories were exaggerated for propaganda purposes, a question historians still debate? What if the U.S. government had not secretly approved Chennault's operation? Would China have been forced to surrender in 1942? Were Chennault's radical air combat theories secretly tested by the U.S. military before the war and rejected, only to be proven right over the skies of Burma? Number 9. What if? Victory depended less on bullets and more on ships. The United States was called the arsenal of democracy for a reason. American factories produced a staggering amount of war material, but all those tanks, jeeps, and shells were useless if you couldn't get them across the ocean to the battlefields in Europe and the Pacific. In 1941, German U-boats were sinking Allied cargo ships faster than they could be built. The Battle of the Atlantic was a war of logistics, and the Allies were losing. They needed ships. They needed thousands of them, and they needed them fast. The man who solved this problem was not a naval architect or a military strategist. He was a California industrialist named Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser had built his empire on massive construction projects like the Hoover and Grand Coulee dams. He knew how to manage huge projects and large workforces. He knew nothing about building ships, but when the government asked him to help, he applied his dam building logic to the shipyard. Traditional shipbuilding was a slow, craft-based process. A ship was built from the keel up in a single location, piece by piece. It could take more than a year to build one cargo ship. Kaiser looked at this and saw a massive inefficiency. He decided to build ships the way Henry Ford built cars on an assembly line. His shipyards, like the one in Richmond, California, were revolutionary. Instead of building the entire ship in one place, they built it in sections. Different parts of the shipyard would build the bow, the stern, the deckhouse, and the engine room all at the same time. These massive prefabricated sections were then brought to the slipway by giant cranes and welded together. He introduced welding instead of riveting, which was faster and created a stronger hull. He recruited a new workforce, including tens of thousands of women who had never worked in heavy industry before. He set up on-site housing, childcare, and healthcare for his workers. He created a system. The results were unbelievable. The ship they were building was a standardized, no-frills cargo vessel called the Liberty ship. It wasn't fast or pretty, but it was big and easy to build. In 1941, it took about 230 days to build one. By the end of the war, Kaiser's shipyards had streamlined the process so much that they could build a Liberty ship in an average of 42 days. In a famous publicity stunt in 1942, his yard in Richmond built a ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from the time the keel was laid to the time it was launched. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards, led by Kaiser's methods, built 2,710 Liberty ships. They built more ships than the U-boats could sink. They formed a floating bridge of steel across the Atlantic carrying the supplies that fueled the Allied war machine. As historian Arthur Herman argues in his book Freedom's Forge, it was this miracle of production that truly turned the tide. Henry J. Kaiser didn't design a new weapon. He weaponized the factory floor. Did Kaiser's shipyards sacrifice safety standards to achieve their incredible production speeds, leading to a higher rate of hull fractures in Liberty ships than is officially acknowledged? How much of the innovative welding and prefabrication technology was developed in secret before the war, waiting for a crisis to be implemented? What would have happened if a single U-boat Wolfpack had managed to successfully raid one of Kaiser's massive, concentrated shipyards on the West Coast? Number 8. How did a socialite become the enemy's most wanted person? Nancy Wake was a wealthy, fashionable journalist living a comfortable life in Marseille, France, with her French industrialist husband. She loved parties, fine clothes, and champagne, but when the war came and France was occupied, she saw the reality of the new regime. She saw people being rounded up, and she decided to do something about it. She started small. She became a courier for a local resistance network. She used her charm and her social connections to move messages and people through checkpoints. She bought an ambulance and used it to help Allied soldiers and airmen who were trapped behind enemy lines escape to neutral Spain. Her work was incredibly dangerous. She was clever and elusive, and the German secret police, the Gestapo, couldn't figure out who this mysterious operative was. They only knew her codename the White Mouse. They put a 5 million franc bounty on her head. She became their most wanted person in the Marseille region. In 1943, her network was betrayed, and she had to flee. She made a grueling trek over the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain. Her husband, Henri Fioca, stayed behind to cover her escape. He was later captured, tortured, and executed. Wake never knew his fate until after the war. She made her way to Britain and immediately volunteered for the Special Operations Executive SOE, the secret organization tasked with conducting espionage and sabotage in occupied Europe. The SOE training was brutal, designed to push recruits to their absolute limit. Wake, the former socialite, excelled. She learned to kill a man with her bare hands, how to handle explosives, and how to survive in the wilderness. In April 1944, just before D-Day, she was parachuted back into central France. Her mission was to organize and lead the local Maquis, the French resistance fighters. She was in charge of distributing weapons and supplies that were airdropped by the Allies. She coordinated their sabotage attacks against railways, bridges, and communication lines to disrupt enemy troop movements and communications, directly supporting the Normandy landings. She was not a behind-the-scenes leader. She fought alongside her men. She led a raid on the local Gestapo headquarters. In one incident, her radio operator had to destroy his codes, and she rode a bicycle for more than 200 kilometers through enemy territory to find a replacement. She was an inspiration to the 7,000 fighters under her command. Her leadership was so effective that the German forces in her area suffered massive casualties and were unable to effectively reinforce their troops in Normandy. Peter Fitzsimon's biography, Nancy Wake, details her numerous exploits, which often sound like something out of a Hollywood movie, but were all too real. Nancy Wake proved that a leader's courage and determination could be as powerful as any weapon. How many Allied airmen did Wake's original escape line in Marseille actually save? A number that is hard to verify due to the chaotic nature of the operations. What were the specific contents of the last messages between Wake and her husband before he was captured? Are there still undiscovered caches of weapons and equipment airdropped for Wake's resistance fighters hidden in the forests and caves of the Auvergne region? Number 7, who was the quiet professor who organized American science for war? In 1940, the United States was a scientific powerhouse, but its research efforts were scattered. Scientists worked in university labs, corporate research departments, and small government agencies. There was no central organization to direct this massive intellectual power towards national defense. Many military leaders were deeply skeptical of civilian scientists, whom they often viewed as eccentric and unreliable. A brilliant new idea for a radar system or a new type of explosive could languish for years in a bureaucratic maze. Vannevar Bush saw this problem. He wasn't a politician or a general. He was an engineer, an inventor, and the president of the Carnegie Institution in Washington, D.C. He had a deep understanding of both the scientific community and the workings of government. He knew that in the coming conflict, victory might depend on technology more than anything else. He believed that the country needed a way to mobilize its scientists quickly and effectively. In the summer of 1940, a year and a half before Pearl Harbor, Bush used his connections to get a meeting with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He went into the Oval Office with a single sheet of paper outlining his idea for a new agency. It would be called the National Defense Research Committee, NDRC. It would be a civilian organization with the power to cut through military red tape, fund promising research, and get new technologies from the lab to the battlefield. Roosevelt read the proposal, which took less than 10 minutes, and simply said, okay, put my initials on that. With that, Bush had the authority he needed. The NDRC, which later evolved into the even more powerful Office of Scientific Research and Development ORDS, transformed the relationship between science and the state. Bush became, in effect, the science czar for the United States. He recruited thousands of the nation's top scientists and engineers. He set up huge new research labs like the MIT Radiation Laboratory, which developed advanced radar systems that were crucial in the Battle of the Atlantic and the air war over Europe. He funded research into new medicines like penicillin and sulfa drugs, which saved hundreds of thousands of lives. He oversaw the development of the proximity fuse, a tiny radio device in an artillery shell that allowed it to explode when it got close to its target, dramatically increasing its effectiveness against aircraft. And most famously, he was the ultimate administrator of the Manhattan Project. While military figures like General Leslie Groves managed the day-to-day construction and security, it was Bush who had initially convinced Roosevelt that an atomic bomb was feasible and who managed the immense scientific and political undertaking. He was the vital link between the theoretical physicists and the president. In his memoir, Pieces of the Action, Bush described his role not as a scientist, but as an organizer of science. He didn't invent radar or the bomb, but he created the system that allowed them to be invented. What other secret research projects, beyond the famous ones, did the Ozard fund that were either failures or were so successful they remain classified to this day? Were there any major ethical debates within the Ozard's leadership about the weapons they were creating, and are any records of these discussions still sealed? How different would the post-war technological landscape have been if Bush had not successfully argued for continued government funding of basic scientific research in his 1945 report, Science, the Endless Frontier? Number 6, could the war's greatest deception be the work of one man? Deception is a key part of warfare. Making your enemy believe you are going to do one thing while you are actually doing another is a classic strategy. During the Second World War, the British intelligence services ran a sophisticated network of double agents to feed false information to the German High Command. This was known as the double-cross system. The most important and most unlikely of all these agents was a man named Juan Pujol Garcia. Pujol was a Spanish citizen, a former chicken farmer and hotel manager from Barcelona. He loathed the German regime and wanted to do something to help the Allies. In 1941, he approached the British embassy in Madrid and offered his services as a spy. They turned him down. They thought he was unstable. So Pujol came up with a new plan. He would pretend to be a pro-German fanatic and offer his services to the Germans instead. They accepted him, they trained him in basic espionage, gave him a code name, Arable, and sent him to Britain to build a spy network. But Pujol never went to Britain. He went to Lisbon, Portugal. From there, he started sending a stream of reports back to his German handlers. He made it all up. He created his reports using a blue guide to Britain, a map, and shipping timetables he found in the library. He invented a fictional network of 27 sub-agents, each with their own personality and backstory. He created a world of pure fantasy, but he made it sound completely believable. His reports were a mix of true, but useless, information from public sources, and brilliant, subtle fabrication. The Germans loved his work. They thought he was their best agent. Meanwhile, Pujol was still trying to contact the Allies. His reports were being intercepted by British codebreakers who were baffled by this highly active German spy ring in Britain that they knew did not exist. Finally, in 1942, they realized what was happening and made contact. Pujol was brought to Britain, where he was given the MI5 codename Garbo because he was the greatest actor in the world. Now, working with the British, Garbo's network became the main channel for feeding deception to the Germans. His masterpiece was Operation Fortitude, the massive deception plan to convince the Germans that the D-Day landings would happen at the Pas de Calais, not in Normandy. Garbo sent hundreds of messages from his fictional spies describing the movements of a fake army, the first U.S. Army group, supposedly based in southeast England. He reported on their training, their divisional patches, and their commander, General George S. Patton. It was all a lie. There were inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, and fake radio traffic, but it was Garbo's reports that made the Germans believe it was real. The deception worked perfectly, even after the landings began in Normandy on June 6, 1944. The German high command was convinced it was just a diversion. They held their powerful panzer divisions in reserve at Pas de Calais, waiting for the real invasion. That 2-week delay was absolutely critical. It gave the Allies the time they needed to establish a secure beachhead. As detailed in Stephen Talty's book, Agent Garbo, the work of this one eccentric Spaniard may have been one of the most decisive factors in the success of D-Day. In a strange twist, Pujol was awarded the Iron Cross by the Germans, who thought he was a hero, and an MBE by the British. How did a man with no intelligence training manage to create such a complex and believable fantasy network completely on his own for over a year? Are the full, unredacted transcripts of Garbo's radio messages to his German handlers still held in classified archives, and what might they reveal about the psychology of deception? Was there ever a moment when a single German intelligence analyst came close to exposing the entire Fortitude deception, and how was that threat neutralized? Number 5. Who was the boat builder who made D-Day possible? Everyone knows about the massive naval armada that crossed the English Channel on D-Day. But the success of the invasion came down to the final 50 yards, getting from the big ships to the hostile shore under heavy fire. But to do that, the Allies needed a special kind of boat. It had to be able to carry a platoon of soldiers or a light vehicle. It had to be fast. And most importantly, it had to be able to run right up onto a beach, drop its cargo, and then quickly back away without getting stuck. The U.S. Navy didn't have a boat like that. Their designs were all based on traditional landing craft that were slow and inefficient. The man who designed and built the boat the Allies needed was Andrew Higgins, a hard-drinking, foul-mouthed boat builder from New Orleans. Higgins built specialized shallow draft boats for loggers and oil drillers, operating in the swamps and bayous of Louisiana. His boats, made of wood and plywood, were known for their ruggedness and their unique hull design, which allowed them to operate in just a few inches of water and run up onto a muddy riverbank. In the late 1930s, the Marine Corps was looking for a better landing craft. They tested Higgins's Orieka boat and were impressed. But it had one major flaw. Soldiers had to jump over the sides to get out, exposing them to enemy fire. A Marine officer suggested that Higgins add a ramp to the front of the boat. Higgins initially resisted the idea, thinking it would ruin the boat's design. But he eventually relented. He and his designers worked around the clock and, in a matter of days, created a new version with a full-width steel ramp at the bow. This was the Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, or LCVP. It was more famously known as the Higgins boat. The Higgins boat was a work of simple genius. It was cheap to build. It was easy to operate. It could carry 36 soldiers or a jeep and 12 men. You know, when it hit the beach, the ramp would drop and the men could charge out quickly. And then the pilot, could reverse the engine and back the boat off the beach to go get another load. When the U.S. entered the war, the demand for Higgins boats exploded. Higgins Industries grew from a small company to a massive enterprise employing over 20,000 workers in New Orleans. His factories, like Kaiser's shipyards, used assembly line techniques to churn out boats at an incredible rate. By the end of the war, they had built over 23,000 of them. These small wooden boats were the key to Allied amphibious strategy. They were used in every single amphibious landing in both the European and Pacific theaters. They landed troops in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy. They landed Marines on the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, in the coral reefs of Tarawa, and on D-Day they were the taxi service that carried the first waves of American soldiers to Omaha and Utah beaches. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower himself said, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us." He argued that without the Higgins boat, the entire strategy of the war would have been different. Jerry Strahan's book, Andrew Higgins and the Boats That Won World War II, provides a detailed account of this underappreciated industrialist. Were there rival landing craft designs that were suppressed by the Navy in favor of Higgins's boat? And if so, were they better? How did Higgins manage to secure the massive quantities of scarce resources, like marine engines and high-quality plywood, needed to build his boats? A story of political and industrial maneuvering that is not fully known. What if a design flaw had been discovered in the LCVP's ramp mechanism just weeks before a major invasion like D-Day? Number 4, did a forgotten general in a forgotten theater rewrite the rules of war? The war in the jungles of Burma was brutal and for a long time a sideshow. The Allied forces there, mostly British, Indian, and African troops, were known as the Forgotten Army. They were at the end of a long supply line, fighting in some of the worst terrain on Earth against a skilled and determined Japanese enemy. For the first few years of the campaign, they were consistently outfought and outmaneuvered. Morale was at rock bottom. The troops felt abandoned and believed the Japanese soldier was an invincible jungle Superman. In 1943, a new commander took over. His name was General William Slim. Slim was not a flashy, aristocratic officer. He was a career soldier who had come up through the ranks. He was practical, down to earth, and he cared deeply about his men. He looked at the situation in Burma and realized that the problem wasn't just about tactics, it was about spirit. First, he addressed the health of the army. Malaria was causing more casualties than the enemy. Slim instituted a strict new anti-malaria discipline with mandatory medication and preventative measures. He dramatically cut the sickness rate. Next, he tackled the supply problem. He knew you couldn't build roads through the jungle, so he decided to supply his army from the air. He invested heavily in transport aircraft and developed new techniques for airdropping supplies to troops deep in enemy territory. This freed his soldiers from being tied to roads. They could now go anywhere. Most importantly, he changed the army's mindset. He knew his men were terrified of being cut off and surrounded by the Japanese, a classic enemy tactic. Slim issued a new order. If you are surrounded, you don't retreat, you dig in, you form a defensive box. And you hold your ground. We will resupply you by air. He traveled tirelessly, visiting units on the front line, talking to ordinary soldiers. He spoke their language, he was honest about the challenges, and he convinced them that they could win. His autobiography, Defeat into Victory, is a masterclass in leadership. The new approach was put to the test in 1944 at the battles of Imphal and Kohima. The Japanese launched a major offensive to invade India. They used their classic tactics, sweeping around the British forces and cutting them off. In previous years, this would have caused a panic and a rout, but not this time. Slim's troops stood their ground. They formed their defensive boxes. The Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces flew thousands of sorties, dropping food, ammunition, and even water to the besieged garrisons. For months, the fighting was intense, but the line held. The Japanese offensive ran out of steam. Their own supply lines broke down. It was a catastrophic defeat for them and the turning point of the Burma campaign. Slim had not just won a battle, he had revolutionized warfare. He had combined air power, infantry tactics, and logistics in a new and decisive way. He had also shown that leadership was about more than just strategy, it was about trust and morale. He took a defeated, demoralized army and turned it into one of the most effective fighting forces of the war. What was the true casualty rate from disease in the Burma campaign before Slim's reforms, a number that may have been deliberately underreported? Did Slim's innovative air supply tactics draw inspiration from classified pre-war British experiments in colonial policing that have never been made public? How close did the besieged garrison at Kohima come to being completely overrun? And was there a moment when Slim considered ordering a retreat that could have changed the outcome of the entire campaign? Number 3, could a single Soviet marshal's ruthlessness save his country? The war on the Eastern Front was fought on a scale and with a ferocity that is hard to comprehend. It was a war of total annihilation. In the desperate early days of the German invasion in 1941, the Red Army was shattered. It suffered millions of casualties. It seemed that the Soviet Union was on the verge of complete collapse. In these moments of crisis, the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, turned to one-man General Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov was a career cavalry officer who had survived the purges of the late 1930s. He was ambitious, incredibly demanding, and utterly ruthless. He had an iron will and a brilliant grasp of operational warfare. He was not a man who cared about casualties. He cared about results, and he got them. Whenever a sector of the front was about to break, Stalin would send Zhukov. In late 1941, he was sent to organize the defense of Moscow. The situation was desperate. He pulled together retreating units, organized civilian militias, and established brutal discipline. Any soldier who retreated without orders was to be shot. He stabilized the front, and then in the dead of the Russian winter, he launched a massive counteroffensive that threw the German army back from the gates of the city. It was the first major strategic defeat the German army had suffered. In 1942, he was sent south to Stalingrad. He was not the field commander there, but he was the coordinator of the overall strategy. He oversaw the planning for Operation Uranus, the massive pincer movement that encircled the German Sixth Army. He insisted on building up overwhelming superiority in men and tanks before launching the attack. The plan worked perfectly. The encirclement of Stalingrad was the war's great turning point on the Eastern Front. Zhukov was a master of maskirovka, the Russian art of military deception. Before the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in history, he correctly predicted where the German offensive would strike. He then built a defense of unprecedented depth, with multiple lines of trenches, minefields, and anti-tank guns. He secretly concentrated huge armored reserves behind the lines. When the German attack came, it broke itself against this defense. Then Zhukov unleashed his reserves, and the Red Army went on the offensive, an offensive that would not stop until it reached Berlin. His methods were undeniably brutal. He used penal battalions, throwing men into battle with little more than a rifle. He ordered massed infantry assaults that resulted in staggering losses. His philosophy was one of attrition. He was willing to trade Russian lives for victory, and the Soviet Union had more lives to trade. As documented in books like Jeffrey Roberts' Stalin's General: The Life of Georgy Zhukov, he was the perfect instrument for the brutal logic of the Eastern Front. He was the firefighter who put out the worst blazes and the hammer that ultimately smashed the opposition. How many of Zhukov's strategic successes were based on intelligence from Allied codebreakers, a contribution the Soviets never officially acknowledged? Were there other less ruthless Soviet generals who proposed alternative strategies that might have achieved victory with fewer casualties but were overruled by Stalin in favor of Zhukov's brutal approach? What is the real story behind Zhukov's political downfall after the war? And did he pose a genuine threat to Stalin's power? Number 2, was a codebreaker the most important person in the war? The war was not just fought on battlefields. It was fought in the ether, in the silent world of radio waves. The German military relied on a machine called Enigma to encrypt its most secret communications. The Enigma machine used a series of rotating wheels and a plug board to create a code that was, in theory, unbreakable. The number of possible daily settings was in the trillions. Like, cracking it seemed impossible, and for years it was. This meant the German High Command could communicate with its armies, air fleets, and U-boat wolf packs with perfect security. The battle to break Enigma took place at a secret British government installation called Bletchley Park. It was a strange collection of wooden huts filled with brilliant eccentrics, mathematicians, linguists, and chess champions. The most brilliant and most eccentric of them all was a mathematician from Cambridge named Alan Turing. Turing was not a soldier. He was a shy, socially awkward academic who was more comfortable with abstract logic than with people, but he had a mind that could see things in a way no one else could. He understood that you couldn't break Enigma by hand. The problem was too big. You needed a machine to fight a machine. Turing, along with his colleague Gordon Welchman, designed a device called the bomb. The bomb was not a computer in the modern sense. It was a huge, noisy electromechanical machine designed for one purpose: to search for the daily Enigma settings. It worked by testing thousands of possible combinations, looking for logical contradictions. Turing's genius was in seeing how to use cribs, short pieces of guessed plain text like a weather report or a standard greeting, to dramatically reduce the number of possibilities the bomb had to check. The work was a constant race. The Germans were constantly improving their procedures and the Enigma machine itself. Turing and his team had to constantly devise new methods to keep up. The intelligence that flowed out of Bletchley Park, codenamed Ultra, was a war-winning weapon. It gave Allied commanders an unprecedented window into the minds of their enemies. They knew where U-boats were planning to attack convoys in the Atlantic. They knew the strength and position of German units before a major battle. They knew what the German high command was thinking. The impact of Ultra is hard to overstate. It is estimated that the work of Turing and his colleagues at Bletchley Park shortened the war by at least 2 years, saving millions of lives. The story is powerfully told in Andrew Hodges' biography, Alan Turing the Enigma, but it was a secret victory. For decades after the war, everyone involved was bound by the Official Secrets Act. They could not speak about what they had done. Turing's contribution was completely unknown. He was a hero who could never be celebrated. His work not only helped win the war, it also laid the theoretical groundwork for the modern digital computer. How much vital ultra-intelligence was deliberately not acted upon by Allied commanders in order to protect the secret that Enigma had been broken? Were there other, even more complex enemy codes that Bletchley Park was never able to crack? And what secrets might they have contained? What if a German spy had successfully infiltrated Bletchley Park and revealed the secret of the bomb bay? How would the war have been different? Number one, what if the true architect of victory never fired a shot? When war broke out in Europe in 1939, the United States Army was tiny. It was the 17th largest in the world, smaller than the Army of Portugal. It was unprepared, under-equipped, and undertrained. Just a few years later, it was a global military superpower, with over 8 million soldiers, fighting and winning a two-front war across the world. The man responsible for this incredible transformation was not a famous battlefield commander. It was a quiet, reserved officer who spent most of the war in an office in Washington, D.C. His name was George C. Marshall. And Marshall was the chief of staff of the U.S. Army from 1939 to 1945. He was, as Winston Churchill called him, the organizer of victory. His job was to build the machine. He had to take a nation that was at peace and turn it into the greatest military power on earth. It was a task of almost unimaginable complexity. First, he had to build the army itself. He oversaw the draft, the creation of dozens of new training camps, and the development of a modern officer corps. He had a unique eye for talent. He was ruthless in weeding out incompetent, time-serving senior officers. And he promoted a new generation of leaders based on merit, not seniority. Men like Dwight D. Eisenhower, George S. Patton, and Omar Bradley owed their careers to Marshall. He saw their potential when no one else did. Second, he had to equip the army. He worked with industrialists like Henry Kaiser and political leaders like Vannevar Bush to turn American industry into an arsenal. He had to decide what to build, how much of it to build, and where it all needed to go. He was the ultimate logistician, managing a global supply chain that stretched from the factories of Detroit to the jungles of New Guinea and the deserts of North Africa. Third, he was the senior military advisor to President Roosevelt. He was a key figure at all the major Allied conferences from Casablanca to Yalta. He was a master strategist, but his greatest contribution was his absolute integrity. He was not a political general. He gave his advice straight, without ego or agenda. Roosevelt trusted him completely. When it came time to choose the supreme Allied commander for the D-Day invasion, everyone assumed the job would go to Marshall. It was the command he had always wanted, but Roosevelt told him, "I didn't feel I could sleep at ease if you were out of Washington." Marshall stayed. He put the needs of the war above his own personal ambition. He was the man who saw the whole picture. While other generals were focused on winning a single battle or campaign, Marshall was focused on winning the entire war. He had to balance the competing demands of the war in Europe and the war in the Pacific. He had to allocate scarce resources. He had to make the hard strategic decisions that shaped the final outcome. Historians like Rick Atkinson in his Liberation trilogy have shown that Marshall's steady hand and strategic vision were the indispensable foundation of the entire Allied effort. He was the quiet man at the center of the storm, the leader who made it all possible. To what extent did Marshall's pre-war experiences in China shape his understanding of logistics and coalition warfare, an area of his life that is not well documented? Are there secret minutes from Marshall's meetings with Roosevelt that reveal fundamental disagreements over grand strategy that were later smoothed over for the historical record? What if Roosevelt had given Marshall the D-Day command? Who would have been his replacement as chief of staff? And how might that have changed the conduct of the global war?